I'm Hanson Hossein. Welcome to Media Space. Our show focuses on the increasingly busy intersection between media and technology. We talk to creative thinkers on the hot-button issues of our digital age. Together, we'll find out how communication technology is changing our lives right now and what might come next. In this episode, University of Washington history professor Margaret O'Mara says she knows why Silicon Valley struck gold as a technology hub, and it's not as obvious as you might think. Indeed, it's such a secret sauce that when Margaret titled her recent foreign policy article, "Don't Try This at Home," government and business leaders are desperate to try it at home as they seek economic salvation in tech. So, is innovation in a box realistic? And how well have we done here in the Puget Sound region with our own technology hub? We'll also bring you into our conversation with Margaret, use the Twitter hashtag MediaSpace, and we'll track your questions. So Margaret, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
What's with Silicon Valley and then Silicon everything? Everybody wants a Silicon Forest or a Silicon Oasis or a Silicon Wadi. What do you tell them?
Well, it's complicated. I tell them, everyone wants to be Silicon Valley because Silicon Valley was this extraordinary success story. It's what venture capitalist John Doerr once called the largest legal creation of wealth on the planet. It was this incredible, unique explosion of technological innovation. And really, if you look at its story, you see kind of three big lessons that come out. Silicon Valley story tells you that, one, you need a lot of money to make a Silicon Valley, but it needs to be money that comes with few strings attached and allows entrepreneurs and businesses to use it as they wish. The second is you need a really good university, and not just a university that happens to be there, but one that has the capacity to really, to not only to produce high quality graduates, but to really innovate and collaborate with the other businesses and institutions in the area. And third, you need to have great location. You need to be a place that this highly mobile, highly educated workforce who could go anywhere, they want to live. It has to be a cool place. It has to be a place that's a magnet and a livable place for educated people.
So you're getting economic development officers from around the world who come to you and who most obviously don't have all three of those wonderful magical qualities. Yes. So how do you let them down gently?
I try not to be too much of a downer, but I do think that having an understanding of the history and how we got where we are is a really essential tool to understand where we go from here. That you have to look at how places like Silicon Valley came to be, why other places didn't become Silicon Valley and what they were missing, and have a really clear-eyed and realistic sense of the role of public policy, the role of markets, the role of individual institutions in making it happen.
I find it very interesting that your most recent piece was actually published in Foreign Policy, which is a really remarkable, esteemed journal that really does focus on foreign policy. Why do you think it was seen as an appropriate medium for the things that you think and research about?
Yeah, well, it was Silicon Valley and the U.S. generally kind of really was very, very good at creating these vibrant technology hubs, not just the Valley, but also places like Seattle, places like Boston, and having the sort of the great ingredients. And other places around the world are really avidly looking at it. And they have, Silicon Valley's been a model for other places around the world for 60 years. But really in the past 20 years, you have countries like rising economic superpowers like India, like China, like Russia, who are wanting to build Silicon Valleys of their own as a way to gain a competitive advantage.
Why do they see it as such a silver bullet? Why is that, of all things? There's so many other economic drivers that you can resort to, but why technology?
Why technology? Well, technology has, it is really, for take Russia, for example, a economy that is still very dependent on kind of old extractive industries, oil and gas. They are, now President Medvedev just announced this year that building an Inograd, which is the Silicon Valley outside of Moscow, and he really sees it as silver bullet as a way of building a new generation economy, a green economy that isn't dependent on these old industries that are eventually going to be obsolete, and second, to retain talent. So it's about educated people. The new economy is about smart, good ideas, smart people, and to retain those within your national borders is what these attempts to build silicon somethings are about.
So should they try this at home, or what should they try at home?
Well, the bad news is that Silicon Valley has proved pretty impossible to imitate, and it has still at the top of the high-tech heap, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. But the good news is that it's not 1960 anymore. That you have, instead of one Silicon Valley, I'd argue that Silicon Valley is really a network of cities, of places places around the world that are part of a global supply chain for technology. You may have the command and control in the Valley, but you have other places in the United States, other places in North America, South America, you name it, that are somehow contributing to that in unique ways. The key for regional economic development officials, I say, is to build on your core competencies, to recognize what you're really good at and not try to imitate and replicate what other people do.
Is the key importance of federal spending on building that region? This is not just some entrepreneurial miracle that happened because we do great business here in the United States, right?
Yeah.
And this might come as kind of a surprise to folks, especially after the most recent election, that the federal government actually does play a huge role in the economic development of this country.
Yeah, the federal government was Silicon Valley's first venture capitalist. It was really providing capital, providing money to these companies where there was no commercial market for their products. And of course, the money was coming in defense spending, right? You know, it's the 1950s, it's the 60s. There's companies like Hewlett-Packard and Varian Associates, these Silicon Valley pioneers, are manufacturing things for which there's not much of a commercial market. And they're really, Defense Department contracts were really important. Similarly with universities, you know, you have Stanford, you have UW, you have MIT and Harvard, these Cold War universities that just explode in size and in influence because of government contracts that are mostly coming from the Defense Department. So.
This country has always been sort of center-right, right? Fairly conservative in terms of the role of government. How back then did they make the sale that government could engage in these partnerships with universities to push this kind of policy?
Yeah. Well, you know, actually, it's a classic, you know, American federalism, and it is, you know, the Cold War military-industrial complex that
Eisenhower
and he talked about with sort of some regret. You know, he was responsible for creating it, and he realized it had gotten kind of an overwhelming force. Rather than saying, we're going to build science cities, we're going to have top-down micromanagement and create these things, they said instead, we're going to use universities and businesses as our agents. So the way the government spends money is it gives money to places like universities and kind of largely gets out of the way for all the grumbling about regulation and those sorts of things. If you compare the United States to other nations, to nations in Western Europe, to nations in East Asia, to Taiwan, to Japan, to India for that matter, there's much less direct government involvement. To China, China is a lot of centralized planning. Russia, you don't have these. The U.S. tends to funnel money through these sort of parastatal entities.
And that's really interesting to me because it seems to me that the Cold War propelled or facilitated the federal government spending this money, somewhat motivated by, say, fear of what was going on in the Soviet Union. And the money got funneled to these universities, these Cold War universities, including this university, University of Washington. And now, in 2010, we're facing this crisis. We're funding for some of these universities. Did the Cold War propel kind of a higher education bubble that's also coming to an end, like everything else we've seen recently, economically speaking?
I wouldn't call it a bubble. What the Cold War built was this extraordinary network of public and private universities that, I mean, if you look at the lists that, sort of annual lists of the top 20 universities in the world, 17 or 18 of them annually are in the U.S. And if you go further down the list, you have universities that are, you know, good but not great universities in the U.S. that are higher ranked than the top national universities in other nations. That's really our competitive advantage. You know, now that we've outsourced almost everything, but still the best and the brightest in the world try and come here to get their undergraduate and graduate degrees. And
are we retaining that competitive advantage? I've been seeing a lot lately in the press that we're losing that as well, that the funding isn't there, or we're getting the best and the brightest aren't necessarily coming our way as much.
I think that we are in danger of that. I think a couple things, particularly in the last 10 years, after 9/11, you have the open doors to foreign students and scholars have shut, or at least foreigners feel like they're not as welcome here, and that funding has gone down. So that slippage, and once that slips, it will not come back. It's really, and it's an investment worth making. The other point about kind of the stealth investment that the federal government has this huge role, but we don't see it. I think that contributes to us not recognizing how important it is. You know, now you have this rhetoric about cutting government spending. You have the places like the Valley, high-tech communities that think the government has anything to do with them. But actually, the government was responsible for kind of creating this foundation on which our new economy is built.
So given the wisdom that you have from your research, and you look at current policy with regards to higher education in this state and other states, What would be your recommendation in terms of what should be the role of the university now, and what should be the funding model for that?
That's a great question. I mean, the thing that's a real challenge in looking after these last elections is now you have an environment in DC that's very anti, cutting back on spending, and so a lot is going to fall to the states to fill the gap, and then you have states and localities that are in giant budget crises of their own, and the challenge that universities have is kind of, in some ways they've been too good at their job. Universities like UW look healthy, look like everything's fine. And if you're making really tough budget choices, if you're a legislator in Olympia, you're like, okay, healthcare for poor kids or investment in the UW, it becomes challenging. The key thing is that the UW and universities like it are huge economic drivers of the economy. We're the third largest employer in the state of Washington. It's the same across the country. This isn't unique. Have a disproportionate economic impact and are kind of the seed money for all this other economic activity. So if you take away that seed funding effectively, the money from the public funding is seeding this. The other thing the public funding does is it makes a place like UW accessible and affordable to kids from, middle class, working class backgrounds. You have first generation college attendees coming here, paying relatively little tuition, much less than peer universities, and having the opportunity to just, to do research with a Nobel Prize winner. And that's
It's an incredible opportunity, it's an incredible resource.
Yeah.
And so that drives me to this question, and reading your book, especially historically speaking, there was still that resistance, even back in the 1940s after World War II, to actually drive money to the universities. I think even Eisenhower's advisors, what do they call it? For all their irritating faults.
Yes.
But what was the crux that really turned it around was Sputnik, right? When the Soviets launched Sputnik, there was that sense in the United States that we'd fallen behind in innovation, that we were and also ran, and we had to devote these resources and get the universities up and running again.
Yeah.
Do we need another Sputnik?
I know. I don't know what another Sputnik what form that would take, but generally, looking back through 200 plus years of American history, it's usually some sort of critical moment that prompts this.
Crisis.
Moment of crisis will prompt this change in behavior. And I would say yes and no. I mean, Sputnik did prompt this outpouring of investment, but going back to 3 years later, you have President Eisenhower saying we have this military-industrial complex. He realized that these defense contractors that had become so powerful and so all-encompassing that it was overshadowing some other priorities. But there does need to be, I think, we need to hit the reset button in terms of how we understand the role of public support and just general, and public I mean by not just government money, but kind of holistic, our citizens supporting the role of higher education and how you foster, understanding how innovation gets fostered, creating space for entrepreneurship, creating opportunities for small startups. And this is not just funding education, it's also going to kind of the third prong of what makes a city of knowledge. It's creating cities, creating places that are going to be, encourage that innovative, creative activity to bubble up, even in tough economic times.
What would you like to see happen that would fall in line with the research you've done and the role that you think universities should be playing in the 21st century? What would you like to see happen in this country?
Well, I actually think this is a bipartisan or a nonpartisan issue. I think it is because it's not just about investing in good ideas. It's investing in smart people, and it's investing in our kids and the kids who are in college now and the kids who are going to be in college in the next generation. It is making these choices to spend money strategically so that universities, and not just elite universities, because the elite universities are probably going to be fine.
Are we, is UW an elite university?
I actually wouldn't say that. I think the sort of the elite private universities that have that sort of those name brands. I mean, UW is great, but I think I think one of the extraordinary things about this university is that it is both kind of elite in the terms of its caliber of research and teaching, and that its student body is, a cross-section of America, certainly a cross-section of Washington State. And I would hate to see that slip away at a place like this, where it just becomes the kids who are well-connected, who can afford it, who, are coming from a different income stream and have different opportunities coming in. The cool thing about higher ed, and this is true from the GI Bill of 1944 forward, is that it has become this democratic American institution where Americans can go to college, and now a college degree has become essential to succeed in the new economy. So to shortchange people's opportunities.
This is a tough conversation, though, because I even sense in the Tea Party dialogue that there is almost this anti-higher ed, anti-elitism conversation going on. And so if you come from Harvard or from Yale or even from the University of Washington, you're painted with a very broad brush that we can't really talk to these people because that's not us. So how do you bridge that divide in this very polarized political system?
Well, it's not new. I mean, the kind of the people versus the powerful rhetoric is something that is, a perpetual theme in American history. I mean, you can go back, we are, that's really sort of defines the American polity is the people versus the powerful. And you have these earlier moments of, kind of populist anger that, arise during moments of great technological change, of global competition, of economic recession. Go back to the 1870s, 1880s with the populist movement that rises up in the West with these farmers that are getting completely shortchanged by the railroads and by the new systems of finance. Go to the 1930s and the Great Depression. And so that rhetoric is really similar. So I'm a little less, yes, we are at this moment, at this particularly heated and partisan moment, but we've been there before, and the pendulum will swing in another direction. I think what's really important is to think about investment in the long term, that we can't let these short-term squabbles detract us from investing in long-term things. And
so back to Silicon Valley then. Was it just an accident of history?
Well, there was a lot of lucky accidents going on, but Silicon Valley was really the right place, right time, and a great combination of both top down and bottom up. From the top down, you have the Cold War spending patterns, which disproportionately went to the Pacific West and particularly to California. You have
this is the Stanford area here.
This is an aerial. Yeah, this is a great aerial shot of sort of near Palo Alto in the late 1940s, early 1950s. It was an aerial survey. And what Silicon Valley was and then was just this agricultural area. It was called the Valley of Heart's Delight. It was this full of orchards, and it actually stayed very rural for quite some time. When I was at Stanford, I had some senior colleagues who'd been teaching there in the 50s and 60s, and they said, when I first came here, it was, we were like living on a farm. It really, Stanford's nickname is the farm. It really was.
And in fact, in many ways, the Cold War policy, this notion you mentioned in your book, dispersion, right? That there was this real fear that if we were hit by the Soviets, by nuclear weapons, that you didn't want to have everything in the cities.
Yeah.
So you push things out, you build this interstate highway system, and all of a sudden you got the suburbs and a very car-oriented culture. So it's amazing how much this policy had an impact on what the country is today.
Yeah, huge. And that's the other way that the Valley was in the right place at the right time. You have all this defense spending coming in, and then it's right, 30 miles south of San Francisco. It's where this suburbanization, becomes this kind of ideal, high-end location for high-end suburbanization. You have all these policies that are aiding, abetting that, highway, housing, all these things. So, and these aren't policies that are explicitly designed to be urban policies or to be technology policies. They're just economic policies, help people buy homes, help people move from point A to point B in a car. That's what it was all about.
Great. Well, you know what? Let's break for a minute, and when we return, questions for Margaret from you. If you have a question you'd like to ask, just jump on Twitter and use the hashtag #MediaSpace. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. So we got our Twitter feed up here, Margaret, and I see one question here from Joe Pavey. How did Silicon Valley weather the 2000 bubble, and what can we learn from that to help us survive the current economic crisis that we're in right now?
Oh, that's a great question. Silicon Valley has had many bubbles, many ups and downs. I mean, that I think what you have to do is you have to recognize that a dynamic, tech-driven economy is a boom and bust economy. Silicon Valley weathered the 2000 bubble. I mean, it popped. I was there then, and everyone's like, "That's it. It's over. Turn out the lights." Again, this was I reminded them, back in 1969, 1970, when there was the defense spending went down, everyone around the valley was saying, "That's it, turn out the lights, it's over." So what happens, weathering the bubble, I think, is just retrenching and waiting for the next thing to come. I mean, what brings a place like the Valley, what brings a place like Seattle out of the downturn is not just is new ideas. So rather than saying, let's wait for these old ideas to come back, we get the new ones. So with Silicon Valley, you got new media, you got the Web 2.0. You went from selling things on the internet to things like Facebook.
Do you think the suburbanization of, say, Seattle, I mean, Seattle's a different beast in itself.
It really is.
Has that detracted from the region's ability to actually present itself as a Silicon Valley? And that's one of ours.
Yeah, I actually don't think so. I think that actually one of the huge advantages has been for places like Seattle and for the Valley themselves has been a preponderance of suburban locations. One of the things that, high tech, when you kind of close your eyes and conjure up a vision of a high tech place, you perhaps think of like the Microsoft campus. It has green space, it's not very citified. And it's only recently that high tech has started returning to the urban core, where you have Amazon, which has always been an urban, based in the city of Seattle, but it's creating opening this huge complex in South Lake Union, and in other places, and also you have smaller startups kind of hanging out under the monorail or down in Pioneer Square. You have these clusters of smaller companies that are urban rather than suburban, and that's different than a generation ago. And
also about Seattle and the Puget Sound region generally, I'm curious, I mean, Stanford was key to Silicon Valley. I don't get the sense, maybe I'm wrong, that University of Washington was as key, and it strikes me, at least when it comes to technology, that Microsoft might have played a larger role than the university did. How would you qualify this region generally in terms of how it came into being?
Yeah, it was really different. I mean, the fact that the Bill Boeing and Bill Gates both being from here made a big difference. But the university also being here, I think, had a big influence. It didn't have this entrepreneurial kind of connection to the up and coming in the early years, in the kind of the early years of the tech, the Silicon Valley or the Silicon era. It wasn't functioning the same way Stanford did. Stanford started these, it was very innovative, started these industrial cooperation programs that horrified all the history faculty members and the English faculty members at the time. I was reading through the archives when I was writing the book, researching the book, and all these letters from the Stanford faculty saying, this is the end of the university as we know it because you've entered this corporate partnership. And of course now that's really normal.
Right.
But then that was a little out there.
I get that, yeah.
But a public university, I think, also has a different role to play and has less flexibility in doing that stuff.
So what do we do best here then?
In Seattle?
Yeah, in this region.
I think Seattle has a lot of competitive advantages. I think that it, like its counterparts on the Pacific West, like LA and San Francisco and Portland, it has this ingrained kind of entrepreneurial business culture that we have that's over a century old. The West is full of people that were rapscallions and outcasts from other parts of the nation and of the world. Yeah, I mean, it's the people who have these crazy ideas that they couldn't get funding for anywhere. I see one of the advantages of the original Silicon Valley is this gold rush mentality that still pervades the business culture and allows VCs to fund people repeated times, even if they fail the first time. And you see some of that in Seattle. You can come, if you're somebody who's smart and has a good idea, you could get funding for it, and if that company completely fails, you could conceivably get funding again, maybe from the same people. So this tolerance of failure and this kind of meritocratic system where you don't have these old entrenched institutions where some people are on top and some people are on bottom, that allows for this flow of ideas. So we have I think Seattle has a lot of strengths. Seattle, I think its size the Seattle region, it's not so big that you can't get kind of key people in the room together to figure out kind of strategies that benefit everybody. And sometimes that's a disadvantage because the tech ecosystem isn't as diverse as Silicon Valley. It's very Microsoft dominated, but it still is, it's not so big that you can't work together and kind of create community.
I think that's what I like most about it as well, is that sense of intimacy, but also the sense of the possible. I think we got some of the best of the Silicon Valley area and some of what really makes this area unique.
And we're cool. People want to move here.
That's absolutely right. Go West, young man or young woman. Come to Seattle.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Margaret, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us today. Tune in again next month online and on air for our next episode of Media Space. I'm Hanson Hossein. We'll leave you with some concluding thoughts from best-selling author Scott Berkun.
One problem with the history books is they romanticize successes more than they help us learn from our failures, despite how much more common the failures are. One factor that gets ignored is luck and how much chance is involved in why one idea or business takes off while similar ones fail. If you pick any winner from history, you'll find a dozen competitors, mostly indistinguishable from the winner. It turns out you can do nearly everything right and still run out of money or be ignored by the world. But this is less fun to hear, so we don't hear it as often as we should. If you want to understand where innovation is happening, look for people who are willing to take risks and endure failure. People who redouble their attention and efforts when things don't go well the first time. Persistence is mandatory because there's never been a big idea that arrived all at once. The cell phone was invented in 1973, decades before you found one in your pocket. And Doug Engelbart made the first computer mouse in 1963, 20 years before the first Apple Macintosh. What we call innovation involves the small moves of hundreds of people, each attempting some kind of progress, mostly failing, but enduring, pushing forward until a problem is actually solved. It's cultures and communities, from parents to teachers to bosses, that don't fear failure and are okay with giving second chances that define our future. Keeping this simple notion in mind might just make your living room, your office, your classroom, the next hotbed of innovation. I'm Scott Birkin for MediaSpace.